Tomorrow marks 30 years since Sydney was announced as a host of the 2000 Olympic Games. And as part of our 30-year celebration of that iconic day, I'm delighted to be able to welcome our next guest to the show who played a key part in making the Sydney Olympics the greatest Olympics of all time. Now, Ric Birch was the executive producer and main director of ceremonies for both the opening and closing ceremonies for the Sydney Olympics, delivering two of the most iconic Olympic ceremonies ever witnessed. And outside of his involvement in the Sydney Olympics, Ric has also played a part in other iconic Olympic opening and closing ceremonies, including the 1984 Los Angeles Summer Olympics, the 1992 Barcelona Summer Olympics, the 2006 Turin Winter Olympics, and the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics. And to learn more about his roles in these, as well as his part in the Sydney Olympics, it's such an honour to welcome off the podium today, the one, the only Mr. Ric Birch. Ric, welcome to the program today.
G'day, Ben. Thank you.
It's such an honour, mate. And I get through all of that, and I feel like I've only scratched the surface on just your involvement in Olympics and everything else. But we're having a bit of a chat off air, and as I said to you, 30 years tomorrow it will be since Sydney was announced as the host of the Olympic Games. I mean, that must be hard to believe that it's been that long, Rich. It seems like yesterday.
Well, yeah, in many ways, although the very first ceremony I did was Brisbane in '82 for the Commonwealth Games, and that's a very long time ago now too. But again, it doesn't seem that long ago. So time's relative, as Mr. Einstein said.
It flies when you're having fun as well. So that kind of works. I want to touch just really briefly on how you even got involved in ceremonies, Ric, because I believe you wanted to be a lawyer at one stage. How do you go to university, find your way trying to be a lawyer, and end up basically being the master of ceremonies for all thing Olympics for close to 40, 50 years or so now?
Yeah, well, obviously I read the wrong book. It's not true, though. It's not true that I ever wanted to be a lawyer. I was given vocational guidance at school because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And they said, you can do anything. So that didn't sort things out much, and I went to Melbourne University to do an arts law course and found out that arts was a lot more fun than law because it involved theatre. And I spent a lot of time in student theatre, actually, and that got me started. Then I went into television, worked with the ABC, and in the 80s I was an executive producer of entertainment with ABC Television in Sydney, and they got the host broadcaster gig for the 1982 Brisbane Commonwealth Games. And the Commonwealth Games organisers had a competition for a ceremonies producer, and I pitched on behalf of the ABC, and we won. And so that was my first ceremony up in Brisbane in 1982, following which the LA organisers, who'd had a couple of observers there, called and said, would I be interested in coming to LA? So, of course, I was, and had a great time in Los Angeles. And that was the start. After that, I never went back to television.
That's incredible. What do you have to submit for a competition for an opening ceremony? Is it just, I'm going to have a giant winking kangaroo called Matilda? Is that it? And that gets you over the line?
Usually, yeah. I've only used that once. No, it's actually far more complicated these days, of course, and very expensive. Back in 81, we pitched in 81. It involved me and a guy named Alan Bateman, who was head of the entertainment department at the time. It involved us both flying up to Brisbane and working out on a piece of paper on the way up how many kids would fit into an arena the size of the QE2 Stadium. And we did that on a pocket calculator, one of those credit card sized pocket calculators, bit of pi r squared and divided by the number of school children in Brisbane. And anyway, so when we got to the Commonwealth Games Foundation, we went through the pitch and said what was in the show, just described it. We didn't have any particularly good graphic aids or anything. And finally, in the end, they said, now, have you checked your numbers and figures? And Alan said, oh, yes, it's all been run through a computer. So they were very impressed because computers were pretty special back in 81. And that's how we get the gig, basically.
Wow.
And from then on, I mean, it gets more complicated. By Beijing, Zhang Yimou was using, 3D animated computer presentations to tell the story to the party leaders. And it's very expensive, costs you, up to $1,000 a second to put that sort of stuff together. So unfortunately, it's become so expensive and challenging these days that only big companies and people who've done it before are in the running. Whereas when I started, there was no infrastructure, there were no expectations, and we could do pretty much what we wanted.
Because it's changed so much too, just in terms of what an opening ceremony or a closing ceremony is, right? I mean, obviously LA is renowned for its groundbreaking nature of what it did for opening ceremonies, and obviously Moscow had a little bit of that 4 years prior. But prior to that, I mean, opening ceremonies were almost very formal, very, very regal, and sort of television sort of changed a lot of that too. But I mean, you joined almost in the golden age of ceremonies when you got involved with them.
Well, yeah, and I mean, in my own small way, I was probably part of the change, because prior to 82, the Commonwealth Games were fairly militaristic, and, they involved honour guards and marching soldiers and rifles being fired in 21-gun salutes, and normally a royal would arrive and inspect the guard, and there was a lot of that, and athletes marched rather than sauntered, and so I saw Moscow when, that was 80, so I would have been about 35 at the time, and was blown away by it. I thought it was absolutely amazing. And then 2 years later, when we were in Brisbane, that was the one to aim for. So I was trying not to do military parades, but was trying to go for entertainment, which worked pretty well. Then in 84 in Los Angeles, we were definitely going for entertainment, but then we were in Los Angeles with Hollywood and music, films, television headquarters. So that was not unexpected. And I think from then on, it certainly set the expectation that a ceremony is, I mean, I don't want to say entertaining in a way that makes it sound like it's lightweight. That's not the idea at all, but that it is a celebration rather than a military pageant, a celebration of the host city.
Was it your idea for the jetpack in 84, Rick? Was that you?
Well, in fact, he'd already been to Melbourne before 1984. His name's Kenny Gibson. And Kenny had been down in Melbourne for a royal show, and he'd done his jetpack in the Melbourne Park, and everyone was bored. And then in Los Angeles, after Los Angeles, he made an absolute fortune. Wow. People were calling him from all over the world to come and fly at their events, including Melbourne. I think they had him back.
Wow, fantastic, fantastic. Fast forward to Sydney when it comes to Sydney putting in that bid. As we know, of course, Brisbane had failed in 92, Melbourne had failed in 96, Sydney ultimately get the gig 93 for 2000. Were you sort of always just touted by everybody who put in a bid for the Olympics? So had Brisbane got it in 92 or Melbourne got it in 96, were you sort of the guy based on the experience that you had, and sort of third time lucky Sydney, you just got that gig, kind of Monaco 1993 when they got it?
Not exactly. It wasn't a lay down misère. The IOC commissions decided the Olympic, back in those days, decided it's 7 years out, so that Barcelona in 92 was decided in 85, and then Sydney was decided in 93. In fact, for Brisbane, which was up against Barcelona, I was actually producing the event where in Australia, where we were watching the results coming in on the TV screen, and we were ready to drop balloons from the ceiling if necessary. As it turned out, we just sort of didn't drop the balloons and had a quiet dinner instead. but probably if Brisbane had got the games in 92, I would certainly have been a part of it. Melbourne, not so much. Ron Walker was a very staunch Melbourne person, and I came from Sydney, so I don't think Ron would have allowed me to.
That didn't stop him from getting on the phone to you, though, for Melbourne 2006. Wasn't he begging you to be involved in the Commonwealth Games, though?
No, it was too late by then. I'd left Australia. But then, apart from Melbourne, Sydney, well, Yeah, Sydney, was involved with from the beginning, and I wrote part of the description of ceremonies in the official bid book. There was still a competition, but by then it was a bit difficult for anyone else because I'd already done 2 Olympics by the time that Sydney came around.
Which, of course, at that time, famously Barcelona. I mean, we talk about moments. We talk about the jetpack in '84. We talk about the Archer in Barcelona, which I'd love to ask a little bit outside of that. But the thing that I find fascinating, Ric, is there's a great documentary on YouTube that was obviously aired just on the eve of when Sydney was announced as the Olympic host city. And it sort of talks to a bunch of key people involved in the bid and sort of what they were planning to bring to Sydney. And there was a brief interview with you in that where you mentioned, even before Sydney got announced, that if it does, the idea of Aussie spirit would be behind the opening ceremony, 7 years at that point later, which was a key theme to that. So you were obviously already kind of having ideas then moving forward that, we get announced as a host city, this is what I want to be. I mean, was that always the key, Aussie spirit? That's what you wanted to showcase in that opening ceremony?
Gosh, how gauche of me, Aussie spirit. I don't know, maybe I was thinking of beer.
I was going to ask, where was all the beer in the opening ceremony, Ric? Like, come on.
Yeah, well, we had to change as we went along. No, actually, I've got no memory of that interview, so I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but certainly as soon as Sydney was a candidate, I started thinking I didn't want to hex anything by having ideas that couldn't be done in the end. But I was very conscious in Monaco when the announcement came out and Juan Antonio Samaranch said, Sydney, at that very moment, John Fay, who was Premier at the time, leapt high in the air. I was more or less at the back of the stadium. He was down the front, and the whole front row leapt up in the air doing Toyota ads as they sort of celebrated. And at that exact moment, I started thinking about the lighting of the cauldron, the piece that finally Cathy did. But as they were jumping in the air, I was thinking of surf, of waves coming down the stadium and a group of lifesavers climbing up through the surf to the top of the stadium to light a torch, which was going to be gas coming through the water, so there was going to be a flame coming out of the water. So that was the initial thought I had right at that minute. And so it changed a bit over the years, but we kept the elements of gas and water and lighting it under extreme difficulties.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you about having that idea then. Is that just a common thing for you, Ric, that these ideas will just hit you at moments, and do you always keep like a little notebook with you to kind of, so you don't forget them?
Well, it's happened so. I mean, I've retired now, so I don't have to rely on it anymore. But yeah, in the past, I have had all my key ideas have come very quickly and very visually, so that I kind of see the whole sequence, and I don't have to tease it out. It arrives fully formed.
Did you ever try and explore the idea of adding sort of surf lifesavers to that moment, or did it sort of, as it developed, it was just like, no, Cathy, torch, flames, platform, that's all we need?
Well, I would love to have done the surf thing. The problem was that initially the stadium hadn't been designed at that point. So I actually did brief 3 different groups of architects, the guys who were designing Sydney Stadium. There was a competition between 3 architectural groups, and I addressed them all and told them that I wanted the North End Stadium waterproof. I didn't go into big detail, but I said I did want to pour water down it. And however, once the stadium had been designed and I was working with O'Barrett, who were the engineers, it became apparent that we just couldn't tip enough water down it to make it look impressive enough. I wanted waves 6 feet deep, which would have emptied Sydney Harbour had we tried to tip it down there. So we ended up with a more circumspect waterfall, but also John Coates and Michael Knight and the powers of SOCOG decided that they would not have the athletes seated in the stands, whereas initially when Sydney won the bid, we were required actually to have the stadiums already seated, the athletes already seated in the stands, which was going to be the first time because the athletes complain that they never see the ceremony. They're always stuck outside the stadium. So Sydney, as part of the bid agreement, agreed that they would have the athletes seated in the stadium. And my plan was always, as the athletes left the stadium, left their seats in the stand, that was where we were going to have the waterfall. As it happened, it was decided to put the athletes outside and sell off the seats. And so most of that stadium, in fact, was full of spectators, so we couldn't have flooded it anyway.
Fascinating. It's also fascinating to think that you, in a way, have a say in the design of a stadium. Is that common for like an opening ceremony or a ceremonies person to kind of have that, or is that just the Ric Birch effect? Like, I get a say in how this stadium's going to be designed.
Well, yeah, it's part of it. No, well, in fact, yeah, we do have an impact on the design because, firstly, the cauldron, which is the critical part of the ceremony, and architects always ignore it. Like the architect for Sydney had no plan whatsoever for a cauldron at the stadium. They said, we'll put it in the main square of the village. That's where it's going to look good. We'll put it in the main square. And I said, that's ridiculous. You know, the whole point of the ceremony, it culminates with the torch coming in from Greece, and it's going to light the cauldron, and that inspires the athletes, inspires the audience, and it signifies the game's beginning. You can't do it like a barbecue down in the village where you light a flame. And so the architects then said, maybe we'll hang it from the roof. And I said, because, you know, they didn't have a clue where to put it, where the audience could see it. And I said, no, well, that doesn't work because everyone's going to look up and only see the underneath of the cauldron. They're not going to see the flame. So anyway, I did have to get involved in the design of the stadium as far as the cauldron, which meant we had to have water and gas, and all that had to be put in underground before they constructed the stands above it. So in that sense, we get involved, not in the design so much as just telling them what we need in the way of infrastructure, and they come up with an engineering solution to it.
That must make your blood absolutely boil, Rick, that at Beijing last year it was just simply let's put the flame, the torch in a holder and rise it up, right? Like save money, right? Come on, that was so lazy, Beijing 2022.
Yeah, actually Beijing was the bird's nest is a very tricky spot to light a cauldron. The same problem. Architects not thinking about it from the beginning.
Which, I mean, that's where you just get somebody running around the top of it. But maybe we can touch on that a little bit. Once Sydney is announced, though, and kind of you officially know it's happening, are you basically on September 24th getting your notebook out and writing further ideas? I mean, do you need that 7-year process to really make sure that you've got everything perfect for September 15, 2000?
No. Sydney was different in several ways. The first part of an Olympic ceremony that a host city gets involved with is actually the flag handover at the Olympics prior, so that in the closing ceremony, the mayor of the incoming city receives the Olympic flag, and there's usually some sort of 10-minute, 12-minute cultural display.
Kangaroos on bikes, Rick. Kangaroos on bikes.
That's the one, best one ever. But in Sydney's case, I got the gig to do the handover ceremony as well as the opening closing ceremonies. So that was unusual. Normally, I don't get involved in the handover, and I normally only get involved 2 to maybe 3 years maximum before. But in Sydney, I was there for 5 years.
Wow.
So I was able to do the handover and then start. But 2 to 3 years is about right for the opening closing ceremonies.
It's something that I always thoroughly enjoy in a closing ceremony is that handover ceremony. And it's something that it's kind of slowly waned, I feel, over the years, just that significance of it, because it is kind of that 10, 12-minute selling point, isn't it? Like, you've enjoyed the last 16 days of these Olympics, but join us in 4 years. The youth of the world, as the president will always say, converge on this city in the next 4 years. I mean, is that almost more pressure to produce a very succinct little package that is selling that on a level that in 4 years' time, you're going to have a little bit longer to try and kind of, signify that city to the world?
Well, a couple of things. In 84, up until 84, the closing ceremony, the flag handover was in the opening ceremony. And it was normally at the beginning of you only got the Olympic flag at the opening ceremony of your Olympics, which was obscure because you'd already been the Olympic city for 4 years. But so we changed that in 84. David Wolper, who was my boss, was the one who instigated. He said, this is crazy to get the flag at the opening ceremony. He said that should be given to the incoming city at the closing. So we did that for Seoul, South Korea, as part of the closing ceremony in Los Angeles. And after that, it always became part of the closing. And yeah, it's true. It's a mini theatrical production. You want to show off your country. In Atlanta in 96, when I did the famous Ruse on Bikes and the rest of it, the whole point of that was to make an impact so that people would remember. And as you say, they've been watching sport for 16 days in a particular city. It's a fairly good chance to remind billions of people around the world that it's going to continue in 4 years in another city. And in fact, it was successful in Atlanta because the morning after the closing, we got the front page on the Atlanta newspaper. Not the American closing ceremony, it was the Australian ceremony that got the front page picture, which meant, from my point of view, it was very successful in telling people where the next games were going to be.
I love that level of humour that always involves, I feel, Australians. That with the closing ceremony, I believe, of Sydney, when you sort of had that whole, like, it was a camera person was going around trying to get into the centre, and you had that sort of reference to the kangaroos on bikes, because that obviously caused some interesting conversations back in Australia back in the day, didn't it, about that, which it was always like making fun of that kind of notion that these were made fun of almost back in the day.
Yeah, I, to this day, never understand exactly what the problem with the kangaroos on bikes was. I think Alan Jones was very against it for whatever reason, and so he became splenetic on radio about these kangaroos on bikes, and that led to a huge uproar. But in fact, it was all totally inoffensive. These were kids riding bikes. They had inflatable kangaroos strapped to their backs. And part of the reason was that originally the plan was that they would ride their bikes in and the kangaroos would inflate on stage. But we found in a couple of cases the inflation didn't happen because something had gone wrong in the backpacks. And so the safest way to do it was to pre-inflate them so that they could ride onto the Atlanta arena already with the kangaroos inflated on their backs, to make sure that later on in the ceremony, if they had to be inflated and they didn't work, that they weren't left with this embarrassing limp rubber thing hanging out of their backpack. So that was actually the reason that it ended up having Ruse cycling in. But it looked so great. The first rehearsal, we saw Stephen Page, who was the director, and I were there. Stephen is Aboriginal, and he was obviously a bit more horrified than I was. I thought it was hysterical watching these kangaroos on bikes coming in. So I said, we've got to do this. We've got to keep it this way. And I still think it was one of the great moments in any Olympic ceremony to see 12 kids cycling and on bikes dressed as kangaroos.
I always loved it. I was, 9 at the time. It was my target demographic, Rick. I loved every second of it. And I say in 5 years' time, when the handover ceremony happens in LA in 2028, bring them back. Bring them back for Brisbane 2030. I mean, are they in a shed somewhere? Can we find them? Do you think they're available somewhere?
I've actually got a bicycle and a kangaroo in a backpack in my basement in Los Angeles. Wow. And I offered it to the Power Museum in Sydney, and they said they're not interested.
Oh.
So there you go.
Well, it's already in LA. You've got half the... You don't have to ship it anywhere. They can just get it. You've got it in a basement, Rick. You just solved the issue.
Perfect. Well, there it is. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Fantastic. Good idea. LA 2028, if you're listening, contact Rick. He's got them ready for you to go for that handover ceremony. I mean, that time, though, I mean, is there like an initial boardroom meeting that you've got the ceremonies crew? You're just sitting there, all right, we've done this bit. Now it's the opening ceremony and closing ceremony of Sydney. Right, any ideas? Like, is it just a whiteboard session for that very first idea? Or, I mean, how does you start planning an Olympic opening ceremony?
Well, I don't know about other producers and directors, but I try and have an overall vision for the whole ceremony. And yeah, in fact, for Sydney, we had a couple of weekend retreats for, I don't know, probably about 20 guys and girls that I'd sort of chosen for their creativity, their ideas from theatre, film, television. And so we had a couple of weekend retreats at a place called Gwingana up in the Gold Coast, where I went and I brought in a couple of guys who'd done ceremonies before in Atlanta or Barcelona. And we kind of talked through the ceremonies, and not just the creativity involved, but the logistics involved, how you have to deal with the athletes, how you handle the preparations, how you do rehearsals, the nuts and bolts of the show without worrying too much about the creative content. And the way I start anyway is I decide who I want to get involved as directors, choreographers, designers, and so on. And then go through the show as it is in my mind, which at least has a shape. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I hated having essays at school when the teacher just say, write an essay about whatever you like. It was never as good as being given a topic. So I always think that for a ceremony, it's better to give the creative team a starting point. So I would always go through the ceremony and with some sort of creative overview, not very detailed, and then portion off segments of the ceremony to individual directors and creative designers and so on, and then let them run with it and see where it went, keep an eye on it. Some ideas would just take off and run, some ideas wouldn't go anywhere, so we'd start again. It's not quite a whiteboard thing, but sometimes it is. A lot of production meetings, people sitting around, throwing ideas around. And as always, you instantly recognize the great ideas. Someone comes up with just an idea, a spark or a moment that leads to other things. Funnily enough, I've never had a problem putting the creatives together. After that, the hard work is making it happen, to actually build it and get the right people in and get the performers, the rehearsal, the music, the costumes, the props, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all just work. The fun part's at the beginning, coming up with the show.
Is there a IOC template in the fact of they say, okay, you need, the specifics, you need the athletes, you need the oath, you need the, all those sort of things. But then do they say you've got 4 hours, or is it a case of you're kind of controlled by a rough time frame of, hey, maybe you can do it within this period? I mean, how does all that template work so that you can fit your creative ideas into all the things that you obviously have to showcase in an Olympic opening ceremony?
Well, that's changed over the years, and I've probably had a hand in some of it because I've been involved in developing the so-called technical manuals for ceremonies that the IOC produce now. We didn't have one in the beginning. But yeah, the protocol moments in the ceremony are the official speeches, the oaths by the athletes and the judge, the raising the Olympic flag, singing of the Olympic hymn, and the lighting of the cauldron. And those are, and of course the march of the athletes, and those are specifically mentioned in the technical manuals as these moments shall be done in such a way, but they can also be interpreted creatively, which the IOC is always very keen on. And the part of the ceremony that people tend to remember, which is the first 45 minutes to an hour, is not really mentioned in the technical manuals. That's just seen as up to each host city how it wants to present itself before the march of the athletes.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing that we notice, I think, more so in the modern ceremonies is the sort of the cultural displays that do signify those opening 45 minutes to an hour seem to almost be getting less and less. They kind of just do it for 20 minutes and now let's get the athletes in, or let's do this, let's do that. to me, what was always great about an opening ceremony is you almost just had that opening hour of let's learn about this city, let's learn about this country. And we seem to have lost that now. I mean, how important is that to hook the people in? Because that's the selling point, right? Like, that's the headline. Here's a man on a horse. Here are all the drovers coming in. Here's Nikki Webster. Like, I want to watch this rather than sit here for another 90 minutes and go, oh, well, here are the athletes. Great, but I want more Nikki Webster.
Well, I'm glad you were there on the night, Ben.
Oh, we'll get to Nikki. Don't worry, Rick. There's a whole hour on Nikki Webster questions. Here we go.
Look, I'm with you. I think that the challenge obviously is to make the 45 minutes to an hour riveting and the sort of thing that you can't stop watching. I think if it is potentially boring, then it shouldn't be very long at all. There's always been controversy over the Parade of the Athletes, whether it should go for 2 hours or 3 hours. And the reality is television networks love the Parade of the Athletes because they get good ratings. And they don't care if it goes for 4 hours. They'll get great ratings for 4 hours and they'll sell advertisements. So any time that we try and shorten it, which I did for Sydney, I came up with a way of shortening it in Sydney, which NBC shot down. And so we were stuck with the same parade length as usual, which is fine. I mean, it just does take a while, that's all. And the other thing that has happened over the years is that the athletes have become less and less disciplined. And whereas they used to march in order and keep in line, now they don't, you see, and they carry their cameras and they're having a really good time. And who can blame them? They're 20 years old and they're in a stadium in front of a world audience. That's what they've trained for. And so, of course, they're going to behave like 20-year-olds. And it does take a while sometimes to herd them into lines and get them to keep marching.
I've got to ask, what's the idea to shorten the athlete parade that NBC didn't like?
Oh, well, we were going to, this was when we were bringing the athletes from the stands when they were seated at the northern end. I was going to bring them down through internal staircases, and then we were going to have a new gate in the stadium directly opposite the VIP stand, so across the short part of the stadium, not the long way, the short way, and bring the athletes in. We could bring them in 16 wide at that point and then split them half to go around the track and then meet up again in front of the VIPs and march back into the field at that point. Now, it wouldn't have made much difference for the small teams, but for the big teams, America, Australia, Canada, Britain, who bring in hundreds of athletes, if you can march them in 16 wide instead of 8 wide, that makes it, halves the time, obviously. And anyway, Dick Ebersol of NBC said, no, that's rubbish. We're going to do it the same old way. And Michael Knight said, I'm with him. So
wow. Jeez.
There it was.
There it was. Hello, NBC, if they're always listening, I'm sure. When it comes to all those cultural aspects, though, just outside of that, when it comes to some of the performances, do you come together or is there one director who's in control of getting the talent where you're like, we got to get John Farnham. We've got to get Olivia Newton-John. Like, you got to get the big names because, I mean, that in a way is always something to draw you into an opening ceremony, is it? Who is Australia's biggest singer? Who is LA's biggest singer? Like, it's kind of that talent, right? And do you remember a list of names you put down on a board of John Farnham, Olivia Newton-John? Were there ones that you just couldn't get for the opening ceremony that you really wanted?
Well, it's funny. In '84, my first Olympics with David Wolper, David said, listen, Rick, the Olympics are bigger than any individual performer. And he said, we can get anyone we want. And in the end of the opening ceremony, it was Reach Out and Touch Somebody's Hand. It was a song which was a big Diana Ross hit. And so I said to David, we get Diana Ross. And he said, no, because this is the Olympics. It's not the Diana Ross concert show.
Wow.
And so we had auditions for a singer and ended up, and unfortunately, I can't remember her name, but she was a checkout chick at a supermarket with an unbelievable voice. And she won the audition. She was fantastic. And she sang, not Diana Ross. And so that was David's approach. We had Etta James was in the show and Lionel Richie was in closing. but we really didn't go for stars, and we're in Los Angeles, so we could have had anyone we wanted. Marvin Hamlish did the Reach Out and Touch orchestration for us. John Williams wrote the theme.
Say you got John Williams at least. That was a pretty big coup.
He was fantastic to work with. I had different, quite well-known performers calling me, auditioning on the phone, saying, "Rick, here's a guitar piece, here's a piano piece. Here, can I do
like
this?"
Who, Rick? Can you spill the secrets? Like who?
No, I'm not going to.
Damn.
But in Australia, it was different because obviously we don't have the same star power as Hollywood. And we have, at the same time, stars like indeed Olivia and John. And they seemed appropriate. For Australia, that was part of our identity in a way that probably American singers are not quite, apart from, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen probably is identifiably American. But John Farnham is absolutely identifiable as an Australian, and certainly in 2000, and the same with Olivia. So there was no question really that if we were going to have performances, that obviously we would want to have the best Australian performers to do them. And I think in the end, we had a fantastic selection of them.
Well, the two that you birthed, we'll talk about Nikki, but the one that often gets overlooked from Sydney 2000, Vanessa Amorosi was basically created because of Sydney 2000. And what a talent. I mean, she's also, I think, become the go-to ceremony person because she was in Melbourne. She was a handover for, I think, Manchester to Melbourne. Then they used her in Birmingham to hand over to the one that aren't happening anymore. But, like, the point is, like, Vanessa was, 17, was she not at the time? And she kind of got that gig. Was a bit overlooked because of Nikki, but just as a talented, if not even, no disrespect to Nikki, even more talented than Nikki.
No, Vanessa had an amazing voice, but she was, we knew about her because she was doing very well on hit parades. I mean, she had some big hits at the time, but an incredible voice, sure, and that's why she was there.
Yeah,
we did miss out on Barry Humphries. I'd asked Barry, and I can say now because poor Barry is no longer with us, but I've known Barry for years, and I said in the closing ceremony, we'd have a piece for Dame Edna in that. And then I thought it'd actually be more fun to have Sir Les than Dame Edna, because yes, Sir Les would have just totally upended the closing ceremony. And we got close, but in the end, Barry decided not to. That's probably my greatest sadness to do with the Olympic ceremonies in Sydney, that Barry wasn't part of them.
Yeah, I mean, the closing ceremonies, you had that great parade with like Paul Hogan, Kylie, Elle Macpherson, Greg Norman. Like, it was such a fun little carriage that would have been. But you had the Dame Edna glasses, though, didn't you, on one of the thong things, didn't you, from memory?
Sorry, the which?
Did you have the giant Dame Edna glasses in the closing ceremony, though, on one of the floats from memory?
I don't think so.
Right. Okay.
I certainly can't remember it. We had, of course, the thongs for Kylie, the flip flops. No, I don't remember giant.
I may be making something up.
Maybe
I'm dreaming of Brisbane 2032, Rick. I mean, I've got to ask.
That's an idea. You're writing this down somewhere.
Mate, trust me. Yeah. Well, we've got some ideas that I need you to pass on very soon. We'll get to that. But I mean, the great thing about Nikki, at the time of us recording this, it's been a week removed since the Women's World Cup wrapped up, and the Matildas sort of used Strawberry Kisses by Nikki Webster as a bit of an anthem. And we've just seen her emerge on stage at the Matildas celebration, and everyone's like, wow, Nikki Webster, there she is. And it's been fantastic. But I don't think people really understand how big of a deal Nikki was on the 16th of September 2000, basically after her performance. And you also birthed this trend of using a child to emerge the world in an opening ceremony. Athens did it 4 years later, if I'm not mistaken. I think you did it again in Beijing, London. I mean, kids lit the goddamn cauldron. I mean, they've stolen your idea, Rick. But what was this idea about using a young child? And can you remember meeting Nikki for the first time and creating this Australian icon that is Nikki Webster?
Well, yeah, yes and yes. The idea for using a young person was obviously symbolic for Australia being a young country. And Nikki's role in that was just to symbolise a young, innocent country, and it grew from there. But yeah, meeting Nikki was amazing. She was already well known theatrically. I mean, she was performing on stage in Sydney by then. She was an actress. But the breathtaking thing about Nikki was that she was 13, not quite 14, during 2000, but she looked about 9 or 10. And that was exactly what we wanted, this sort of young, freckle-faced, innocent little girl gambling around the field. And it worked so well because Nikki was so free and innocent with all this pressure on her. She seemed to be enjoying herself, and I think she probably was. She's an amazing performer.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have a daughter who's a bit younger than Nikki, and she was furious that I did not give her the gig. She has still never forgiven me.
Wow.
All she wanted to do was fly in the air like Nikki Webster. But Nikki was amazing. We had several contenders, but Nikki was without question by far the best.
I love that idea of every single time there's some sort of Sydney 2000 anniversary, your daughter just like, don't want to be involved in it, Dad, bugger off. Like, come on. She hates Nikki. She hears Strawberry Kisses and just gets angry. That could have been me. I like this idea of it. Do you have much of a say in who gets to light the cauldron, or is that purely like an AOC SOCOG idea? And if so, where did was Cathy's name an early one that was touted sort of? Because I remember the secrecy around that and all the speculation of who's lighting the cauldron. I mean, can you tell us a bit about that process, about how Cathy gets selected?
Well, it's very much an Olympic decision. It's an organising committee decision. No, and I've never been involved in the decision. I just get told the result. I think for 2000, John Coates knew from the beginning that it was going to be women. It was the year of the women in Olympics anyway. So John was, I think, completely instrumental in the choice of who was there and who lit the cauldron. I mean, looking back, Cathy is the obvious choice, and was certainly, she was being touted around in the press more than anyone else. But we didn't find out until only a few days before. And of course, Cathy had to rehearse with the cauldron and the lighting of the cauldron, which she did the night before. Poor darling, she got saturated, soaked with spray, and she wasn't feeling too good anyway. She's a real trooper and kept going. Normally, we do rehearse with the torchbearer. They come into the stadium, usually under complete secrecy. Like Muhammad Ali in '96, I was there for the rehearsal, and it was very secure. And with Cathy, in fact, we were rehearsing about midnight, and one of the security guards showed up with his family. He'd brought the family to the stadium just to show them around, and there was a security guard and his family taking photos of Cathy lighting the cauldron.
Wow!
Until we spotted him and said, "Now, don't do anything with those photos or you're going to lose your job." So they were very good and they didn't say anything. But, we try and keep it secret, not because it is a secret so much as we just want to keep it for a surprise.
That's fascinating, because, I mean, how would you get away with that today when all he would have had to do is take a picture on a phone and it's on Twitter in 5 minutes, whereas at least back... Because I think that was the biggest thing. I think everybody that night was just still speculating. Like, it's like 5 o'clock on that Friday afternoon. Everyone's like, who's doing it? Who's doing it? And then, as you mentioned, it was 100 years of women in the Olympics. So you had, Shane Gould, Betty Cuthbert, all these icons sort of in the stadium, and then handing it over to Cathy. I mean, it's just, does that make you, when you get to that moment, we'll talk about those 3 minutes 40, that probably the longest of your life in a moment. But like when you get to that point, you realize it, I guess, has been kept a secret, because as far as I remember, it wasn't leaked. That was an absolute secret until the moment Cathy got that torch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing that was, for me, a very welcome surprise was that we had I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 rehearsals before the opening now, at least, I think 2, full dress rehearsals with an audience, and the audience were invited. They were the parents and friends, teachers of the performers. So we had 100,000 people at each of the rehearsals. And David Atkins and I went on the stage before the rehearsal. And I said to the crowd, listen, we're thrilled that you're going to be here. We're thrilled that we can put the show on. But we just have one request, and that is do not share the content of the ceremonies. And certainly don't share photographs until, opening night. And as far as I know, no one did. And no newspaper ever published a photo from any of the rehearsals. There was no discussion in the papers. Whereas before that, we'd had helicopters coming over for rehearsals. We'd had journalists trying to join the rehearsals as performers and so on. Also, they could run spoiler stories saying, this is what's in the stadium show. And I actually did a TV appearance early when it started to happen. And I was on TV saying, I don't know why you want to spoil the ceremony by telling everyone what's in it. You'll find out soon enough. It's not like you will never get to see the show. But there are 10,000 people, 13,000 in Sydney, 13,000 people who've been rehearsing to do this, to present it to you, and all you networks are trying to do is to spoil it. And so after that, it turned around a bit, and television viewers said, yeah, we don't want to know. And so suddenly the media stopped trying to spoil the story, and I think it was much more successful for that reason.
Were those 3 minutes and 40 seconds where that cauldron would not move the longest 3 minutes and 40 seconds of your life, Ric?
Well, second only to our technical director, who's a fabulous Texan tech director named Morris Leider. And I'd met Morris in Barcelona, actually, in 92. He was the production manager for U2 and Genesis and Pink Floyd and Rolling Stones. So he's one of the world's greats. And he ended up marrying an Australian girl and moved to Sydney. So that was a great opportunity. So I hired Morris as a technical director and didn't worry about anything technical from that moment on. And so at the opening ceremony, we had the waterfall effect, which came down the Northern Stand, was built some months before the actual ceremony. And I was there one day after a football match, and I saw a couple of Coca-Cola cans had been thrown into the waterfall. And I thought at the time, oh God, if that happens on the night, there's a chance that a Coke can could get caught up in the cogs of the thing and the cauldron could get jammed. And I thought, oh, if that happens, we don't want it to run out of gas. So I said to Morris Leider, can you get any more gas in the cauldron in case there's a delay? So he came back next day and said, yeah, we've fixed it, no worries. And so I stopped worrying. And then on the night, Morris was looking rather white, and there are other things going on. I was starting to write a voiceover piece for the announcer who was going to say, well, that's it, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for da-da-da-da. And cue the fireworks, and with hopefully get an umbilical cord of gas or something to the cauldron. But as it turned out, Morris told me later that the cauldron stopped for a reason, and no one will ever know why. We honestly don't know why. There were 3 triggers that were involved in the lift of the cauldron, and each trigger signified to the computer to take the next step. And what had happened is the third of the 3 had triggered already. And so the cauldron mechanism started pulling uphill with the cauldron not attached correctly. So then it stopped because it knew it wasn't connected properly. But it had moved about 6 inches, which meant that the cauldron could no longer mate properly with the carrier. Anyway, it took the guys 3 minutes and 40 seconds to work out what was wrong, correct it, and get it going again. And as I said, Morris was looking very white. And when it was all over, he said, Ric, I told you that we've got more gas in the cauldron. He said, I lied. We couldn't. There was no more room. No more space. He thought there was about 20 seconds of gas left when it, finally the cauldron.
Wow. Jeez, that's incredible. I mean, I actually want to say that, to be honest, you started a trend, just like Nikki Webster started a trend with young children. You started a trend with faults in opening ceremonies. Because if you remember Vancouver, they had the 4 cauldrons and one of them didn't work. And Sochi, one of the rings didn't light up. So I'm just saying that there was a plan there, right? Future opening ceremonies took that as like I'm going to do what Sydney did. Let's have a mistake to make it, more controversial. Come on.
Well, in fact, in Barcelona, I asked Antoni Rebollo, who was the archer who fired the arrow. I said to Antoni, listen, you know how in circuses they do a trapeze thing? They say, and now for the first time ever in the world, we're going to do the triple somersault and drum roll, and they attempt it and it doesn't quite work. And everyone goes, oh, and he said, but wait, we're going to try it again. And then the second time they do it.
Yeah.
And I said to Antoni, what would be really good is if you miss on the first shot. So people know that, this is not mechanical, this does have risk and it is possible to get it wrong. And so if you miss on the first one, then the second one, the crowd will go crazy. And he just looked at me and said, I will not miss. That was it.
Wow. I kind of like your idea better, though. That kind of, that build-up. I will say, I'm mentioning to you a little bit off air about how every time I go out to Homebush, I get a bit geeked out by everything. But the one that still always gets me is the cauldron there in Cathy Freeman Park. It's just there. And it's just, you go to an event at Kudos Bank Arena and you got to walk through the park to get to the train and you just walk underneath it. There's the cauldron. There's Cathy's moment. There was all that back in 2000. It just baffles me, Rick, that so many people just walk underneath that and don't even realize what it is. I met someone there during the World Cup who didn't know that was it. Who didn't know what it was. And I'm like, this is history. This is the cauldron. I geek out, Rick, so I just need to mention that to you at least.
No, it's good. I've actually only been back to Homebush 2 or 3 times since Sydney 2000. And, the cauldron is definitely the cauldron. I just think it doesn't quite look right with all those spidery legs it's sitting on. Because the great thing about the cauldron was that it appeared to rise all by itself. It didn't have any visible means of support. And so now I think it's an icon, but I would rather have seen it suspended. You know how you can have fountains of water and it appears that a column of water is holding it up.
Vancouver, in downtown Vancouver, they've got their cauldron right on the waterfront with a fountain surrounding it. Kind of, this is our cauldron we had. So Vancouver do something similar to that.
Well, so there it is. Maybe we should take Cathy's cauldron to Vancouver.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's a threat. Make it better, Sydney, or we'll do it that. I don't know if you sort of have been, obviously, I probably asked this question multiple times, or if you do this, because I'm sure each of your ceremonies is probably a bit like a child, Rick, but do you look back at Sydney and sort of hold that above some of the other ceremonies that you've done, or do you not like to kind of rank your children?
Yeah, you can't really rank your children. They're very much of each time. I mean, if I was going to do a Sydney ceremony now, it'd be completely different to 2000. The world has moved on. So each one is kind of in a bubble of time. But overall, the one that I probably enjoyed the most was Barcelona. Barcelona in 92 was just the best time, partly because Barcelona as a city had been ignored by Generalissimo Franco, the Spanish leader, until he died in 79. Until then, the Catalan language had been repressed, the Catalan people had been repressed, Barcelona had been repressed. And so suddenly Barcelona started to flower. And by the Olympics, it had redone the roads, redone the water, the sewerage, the pipes, the drainage. The whole city the infrastructure had been replaced. And suddenly tourists discovered Barcelona, and the Olympics had a great deal to do with that. And in the build-up to the ceremony, we were working with a lot of different creative Catalans, and it was just a very exciting time. And the idea of working with 8 different creative directors, which we did in Barcelona, was something that I enjoyed so much. That's why we had multiple directors in Sydney. In Los Angeles, we only had one creative director, one designer, one choreographer, which is kind of classic Hollywood hierarchy. But in Barcelona, we had 8 different people, and I found that it worked really well. And that's why in Sydney we had multiple directors. And I think it's the best model for something like an Olympics.
Yeah, iconic Barcelona. You mentioned the archer, everything else that came with that. I mean, just a couple of things I want to touch on, Rick, before we let you go. I mean, I'd like to say we're a little bit critical on this show now of modern opening ceremonies. Just, let's use some giant LED screens on the floor and, let's not use props and giant things like that. Obviously, there's costs involved and budgets. I understand that. And obviously, we could probably spend another hour talking about your involvement in Rio and sort of you eventually pulling out of that. But what do you think of the modern direction of opening ceremonies? Do we need to streamline them into this LED because we've got the technology? Do we want the props back, the giant jellyfish that you had in Sydney? Like, what's your take on how opening ceremonies and closing ceremonies are done compared to when you were more involved in them?
Well, yeah, I agree. I think using LED and projection and so on, for me, is a cop-out. The ceremony, for me, is designed for the people in the stand, in the stadium. You've got a live audience, and television can look after itself. Television can cover the ceremony, but the ceremony has to work for the live audience in the stadium. And to me, it's a real cop-out to have video screens or video projection instead of people with props and costumes, because you may as well stay at home watching television. What's the special experience of paying huge amounts of money to go and sit in a stadium and then watch a television screen? No, so I agree. I think the modern ceremonies are the antithesis of what they should be. And I think the really wondrous thing about a successful Olympic ceremony is watching human beings instead of watching technology. To watch human beings, and especially when they're young, and the whole thing about the Olympics, the athletes are young. It is a celebration of youth, and you want that exuberance, you want the energy, you want the colour and movement, excitement of all of that. And to do it with a television screen or a projector, to me, is a totally wasted and lost opportunity.
Completely agree. How do you think Paris is going to fare with this idea of doing an opening ceremony down the Seine? Do you sort of like what they're going to do next year?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it for Sydney. At one stage, there was a bit of pressure coming on to say, why don't we do it in Sydney Harbour, which was driven by the Tourist Commission, who wanted to have pictures of beautiful Sydney Harbour going around the world. But Sydney Harbour, it wouldn't work. And I said, look, you can't do it. You're not going to see the athletes. The distances are just way too big. And besides, Sydney Harbour is not an Olympic stadium. And I still think that Olympic stadiums are kind of fairly important to the notion of a ceremony. However, the Seine, I think, is potentially different because it's only about 100 metres across. And people will be able to line the Seine. It's like a track. Sydney Harbour is not. But the Seine is a straight shot. You can bring the athletes down. They can be close enough to either bank to be seen. I think it's sad in one way that the athletes will just be stuck on boats, whereas watching them in a stadium, you can see they dance, they run around, they're obviously having a great time. They're not going to be able to do that on a barge or a boat. They're just going to be stuck there. So I doubt whether anyone will do it again. I think the Seine, people will end up watching it, and it'll be exactly like watching a parade going by, fairly lifeless in terms of the exuberance and the emotion of the athletes. So I think long term that won't be repeated. I think it'll go back to the stadium.
Can you use the top of the Eiffel Tower as the flame? Like, I don't know what the scope is at the very top of the Eiffel Tower. I'm just picturing like maybe an archer lighting the top of the Eiffel Tower.
It's a very good idea. Someone going up there with a cigarette lighter and flicking a bic at the top.
Very French.
Yeah,
I put this cigarette out.
At least everyone will be able to see it.
Yes, I like that. I mean, Rick, obviously, before I let you go, I've got Brisbane. I've read your comments. I was obviously, you said you're retired, but I'm sure if somebody tapped you on the shoulder, you might be kind of willing to maybe put some ideas forth. But I've got some ideas if you know people. If they want to, can I pass a couple of ideas to the people if you do get involved in Brisbane to help out? Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
All right. Okay. First one, talking on big name music acts, right? Now, a certain band called Savage Garden is from Brisbane, and I know Darren and Daniel don't really talk anymore. They've been split up for a long time, but Brisbane, home city Olympics, 2032, the reunion Australia all wants. Darren and Daniel back together at the Gabba, 2032. Can we make it happen?
Not on my watch.
Oh,
I mean, it's not a Savage Garden concert, Ben. I keep telling you the Olympics are bigger than the performers.
well, yeah, okay, I'll give you that one. But okay, right, well, this one. Now, this is the cauldron idea. Now, I have put this to both the people I think we can get involved. Two iconic Queenslanders, Kieran Perkins and Stephen Bradbury. Now, picture this. 50,000 people at the Gabba. Billions of people around the world. The cauldron is about to be lit. Kieran Perkins has the torch. Everyone, yeah, here he is. Great Queenslander Kieran Perkins. Yes, he goes to light the cauldron. He falls over. What's happened? Kieran's fallen over. Oh no. Who comes in to pick up the cauldron, the torch? Stephen Bradbury lights it. Now, I know he's a Winter Olympian, but again, Rick, this is being held in July. That's winter in Australia. Technically a Winter Olympics. Stephen and Kieran are both on board. Can we get the Master of Ceremonies on board to pass this on? That's a perfect idea.
I can't see why not, except, and I don't know if you're aware of this, Sally Rhodes, a British astronaut, Sheffield, 1990 or 91, I think. It might even have been 92, I can't remember, early 90s. And Sally Rhodes was the torchbearer, celebrated astronaut, was Britain's first, and she was running along with the torch, just getting up to the point where there was a ramp going up to the cauldron, and they'd put a piece of astroturf across from the inside of the track, the field, across to the track, and there's a running rail that's about 2 or 3 inches high that runs all around the track, and some idiot had put the astroturf over the top of it. Sally didn't know. Boom! Fell to the ground.
Ouch.
The torch fell to the ground, and the sterno, because they had a kind of a burning petroleum jelly kind of stuff in the torch, it fell out onto the track and started setting fire to the track. So there's poor Sally spread-eagled on the track while officials are busily stamping out flames on the track. So kind of the imagery and the symbolism of stamping out the flame that someone's just been delivering to you. So anyway, they lit the cauldron with a bic and the whole thing went on. But
it's a bit too close to, okay, I see it. But bring Sally in. Is Sally still with us? We can kind of like make a joke out of it the Australian way, right?
Well, yeah, and maybe she could keep running while the Australians trip over.
Yes, exactly. Like she could be the new Stephen Bradbury, right? Like it just, it goes through there. Well, I mean, if you want to take some of those ideas, Rick, and kind of pass it on. Yeah. But I mean, like in all seriousness, again, I sort of read your interview comments and that before about sort of that, and I'm not going to touch on your age, Rick. You're still a young spring chicken, but it'd be a nice bookend to your career, of course, wouldn't it? Brisbane 82 for the Commonwealth Games, 2032 for the Olympics. Nice 50-year journey to be involved somehow.
Well, it does seem incredibly symmetrical. Yeah, I mean, look, honestly, if Brisbane is interested, I'd be delighted to have some role. I certainly wouldn't be interested or even available to work full-time. But, yeah, if I could contribute something useful, yeah, of course, why not?
There you go. You're listening, Brisbane Organising Committee. Rick's happy to put his hand up for some part of it. Rick, mate, it's been an absolute honour to sort of reminisce here and go over everything to do with your involvement in Sydney and other great Olympic moments as well. And such a pleasure to hear from those stories. So we thank you so much for your time here and Off the Podium, and hope you enjoy those retirement days and whatever you hopefully will be involved in Brisbane 2032 if it does come around.
Well, thank you, Ben. Nice to talk. Nice to find that Sydney is still remembered.